Well, welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And, of course, as always, that means some smart talk radios in your future. In this segment, very, very excited to have Dr. Irwin Gellman with us. He is a scholar indeed in a brand new, very, very comprehensive, interesting work called The President and the Apprentice, Eisenhower and Nixon, 1952 to 1961. Who is Irwin Gellman? He has taught at several American universities and now an independent scholar living in the Philadelphia suburbs. Not that that matters one way or the other. His prior books include The Contender, an account of Richard Nixon's congressional years, Secret Affairs, the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, and Sumner Welles, Good Neighbor Diplomacy, on and on and on and on and on. And we are pleased to have him here. Irv, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Well, we're good. We have talked a little bit about Richard Nixon. We've touched on Dwight David Eisenhower in the past 15 to 16 years of this show, but we've never talked about them really together. And this work is seems really, really fascinating to me. Share with our listeners, if you would, why these two and why this book?
Well, why these two is because they had such an intimate connection with one another over the 8 years of the Eisenhower presidency. Why this book? My wife tricked me in going to the Nixon Library 20 years ago, and I didn't want to do anything on Richard Nixon, but she had a luncheon planned, and she made me get in the car. We lived in Newport Beach, California, and it was about a 40-minute drive to Yorba Linda. They took me to the archives. I started reading some of the original documents, and after all these years, I'm convinced that the Nixon Library will be the finest right-of-center history in the second half of the 20th century.
What about, let me ask you this, have you been to Abilene, Kansas, to the Eisenhower Museum?
Since about 1967, I've made maybe 5 or 10 trips.
So you know that area well. That's
not only do I know the area well, but something that saddens me a bit is there's maybe 100,000 plus documents on microfilm. You don't even have to leave your local library, and very, very few people even bother looking at the stuff that is readily available and crucial to anybody who writes on President Eisenhower.
What? Let's start here. Let's talk about maybe America's perception of these two, and that might have been was Eisenhower just in general. You get the impression that Dwight Eisenhower looked at Richard Nixon as somewhat of an irritant at some level. Is that fair, or is that not fair?
It's unfair, but it goes with the conventional wisdom that Eisenhower was a grandfatherly type, smiling, golf-playing twit who didn't know what he was doing, and Richard Nixon was just the reincarnation of evil.
And tell us, let's start this. Talk to us about their early relationship, how they met, or if nothing else, how they began to work together in the first place.
Well, they met over Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was a convicted perjurer and really a Russian spy, and there's very little doubt of that anymore. But their nexus came when John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State under Eisenhower, was president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, lobbied for and got Alger Hiss to be president, and lobbied for and put Dwight Eisenhower on the board of directors. Because Eisenhower and Dulles were connected, Nixon interviewed Hiss and figured out that he was a spy, gave Dulles a heads up. Eisenhower read the ultimate book that was written on how Nixon went after him and felt that he did a fair job, and that Richard Nixon was a stellar personality.
What about, and again, was this a unique time in American history for these two men to come together in a political alliance? Would this have happened in another era, or could this have happened any time?
I don't think so, because what is, again, the conventional wisdom is that Eisenhower wasn't very bright as president. I find that ludicrous, because here's the guy that organize the most complicated, largest amphibian invasion in world history, and all of a sudden he goes from brilliant to idiotic. It doesn't make sense. But Eisenhower, unlike today, really was very comfortable in his own skin, wasn't worried about what other folks said, and really ran his government under what he called a team approach. Everybody worked, whether you were vice president or whomever, and everybody pulled in the same direction, of course, with Eisenhower's direction. I think it's going to be very, very hard to find somebody who acts in, for want of a better word, a non-partial way to get things done.
Conversely, or what about if you put yourself into the skin of Richard Nixon looking towards Dwight Eisenhower? It may feel obvious to everybody, but tell us about what did he feel originally about Eisenhower, and how did he see himself juxtaposition to him?
Well, again, the conventional wisdom says that they didn't like one another, and the conventional wisdom is just 180 degrees wrong. Nixon was one of Eisenhower's early supporters because he felt that he was the only one that would be able to beat the Democrat in the 1952 presidential election. And after he becomes Ike's running mate and Ike's vice president, he tries with all of his energy to make himself an integral part of the administration. And as he performs better and better, Eisenhower gives him more difficult assignments. Nixon does them very well, and he becomes a trusted advisor to the president.
Again, if you just joined us, here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Got a good one going here with Irwin F. Gellman. He's the author of a brand new, extraordinary, comprehensive work called The President and the Apprentice, Eisenhower and Nixon, 1952 to 61. What, we've touched on this, and I agree with you. A lot of people feel that Ike is a five-star general. He comes off the high, so to speak, and the positive feelings of his work in World War II. Kind of like George Washington, maybe these people not necessarily thinking of themselves as presidential material and humble in some ways, but realistically take us inside Eisenhower. How shrewd was he? How calculated was he? How did he fare as a politician?
Well, that is probably the $64 question. The fact is he was brilliant. He was a brilliant organizer, and an aside is one of his heroes was George Washington. What Eisenhower did, which so few people had, was he had specific views. He had specific world views. He had been stationed in Panama. He had been stationed in the Philippines. He had been stationed in North Africa, in Europe, in England, and he didn't need advisors to give him his strategic worldview. He had one already, and he fit advice into what he already had conceptualized. As far as domestic affairs, same thing. He wanted to balance the budget. He believed deeply that the United States had to have a strong economy if you were going to have a strong government, not the other way around. And lastly, he pretended that he was not a politician and generated interest from everyone, when in effect he sent Nixon out during the 52 election, the 56 election, and then the midterm elections of 54 and 58, and said privately, "You go get them." And then when he was publicly asked, he said, "What?"
You can't, it's impossible to talk about this here without at least bringing up Joe McCarthy. Talk to us again. A lot of people may not know the intensity of the feeling towards Senator McCarthy from Eisenhower. Share with us a little bit about that.
Again, the perceived wisdom is that Joe McCarthy was a bombastic, for want of a better word, scumbag, who tore down a number of innocent people while Eisenhower passively watched as McCarthy went into a stupor and died of cirrhosis of the liver. And that Nixon, as Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee for president in 52 and 56, said, Nixon was a McCarthy in a white collar. None of that is true. Eisenhower looked upon McCarthy as a buffoon, but really didn't go after him until towards the end of 1953, when McCarthy attacked Eisenhower's beloved army. And then he organized and orchestrated McCarthy's downfall. One of the interesting things about McCarthy that very few people mention, especially up in Massachusetts, is McCarthy was very close with Joseph Kennedy, with John Kennedy, and with Robert Kennedy. And when McCarthy is being buried in Appleton, Wisconsin in 1957, Bobby Kennedy is part of the funeral, and he asks the media not to mention that he was there.
What about, again, when we go back into this era and we think about all the things that were going on there, the psyche and the political atmosphere, is it fair to say that Americans were less interested as to who was holding office and more interested in establishing families, careers, etc.? Was politics front and center the way it was later, obviously, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s?
No, the politics that Eisenhower went was, yes, very partisan, but not nearly as shrill as it is today. The nature of the Eisenhower politics was in your face, nasty, but for want of a better word, not nearly as polarizing. You didn't have a 24/7 newscast with people looking at the most salacious things various politicians could do and see the one-upmanship today of how you can make sensational charges. The idea then may not have been prettier, but it certainly didn't have the volume.
What about, again, these are two gentlemen, in essence, from the Midwest, Eisenhower and Truman. What about, tell us about the relationship that those two had, especially during those transitional years of power.
Well, Truman was the ultimate Democrat and asked Eisenhower if he would run for president in 1948, and Truman would run on the ticket as the vice president. Once Eisenhower announced in 52 that he was running on the Republican ticket, Harry Truman went after him with a vengeance. And by the end of the campaign, they weren't talking to one another, and during the ride from the White House to the inaugural, they were in the same limousine, and they didn't talk to one another. And they sort of kind of heal when they're at the funeral of John F. Kennedy, but even then, there's not a real warm, fuzzy feeling between these two men.
Interesting. You'd think they would have a lot in common, but anyway, so be it. What about? Let's shift our focus to Richard Nixon here for a little bit. 1952. The famous Chequers speech. Share with our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, Dr. Gellman, a little bit about that and how uncomfortable and how awkward was that for President Eisenhower and his support or non-support of all that?
Well, again, the conventional wisdom is that Eisenhower couldn't stand Nixon and was ready to get rid of him off the ticket. Eisenhower never expressed any interest in getting Nixon off the ticket. He knew there was a tremendous downside. But the Chequers speech was an article in the New York Post on September 18, 1952, claiming in banner headlines that Nixon lived way above his means by support of millionaire supporters. The problem was, if you read the article, the banner headline and the article had nothing to do with one another. But it was enough to create uncertainty within the Eisenhower camp because he was running on an absolutely clean, non-corrupt administration because of all of the scandals in the Truman administration. So Nixon had to go on national television and bare his soul and say, I am as good as it gets. There was no slush fund. I had a fund which many politicians had, and here is what's in it, and here's what I'm doing. And at the end of it, about 3 million people wrote in, signed petitions, sent telegrams, and the estimate is somewhere the approval was 350 to 1.
One of the other big names, you can't refute the influence of Lyndon Johnson, even at the time. In that time, there is a great deal. I don't think history teaches this terribly factually, and I think in your book you address this, that Lyndon Johnson's given a lot of credit for pushing the Civil Rights Act. And the fact of the matter is Ike had a lot to do with that. Share with our listeners a little bit about that.
Well, will you humor me for a second?
You bet. I'll humor you for more than that.
Herbert Brownell Jr., the Attorney General, who was one of the most avid supporters of civil rights, drafted the legislation. More Republicans in the Senate than Democrats voted for the legislation. Dwight Eisenhower signed the legislation, and Dwight Eisenhower implemented the legislation. Did you hear me mention Lyndon Johnson?
Not yet.
Amen.
What about again? And I know it's not in the 50s, nowhere near obviously what it is today, the 24/7 news cycle and the social media and all the other ways of communication. But in general, how did the media take to Ike? We know later Richard Nixon's relationship with the media, but during those years, 52 to 61, how were they with the media, and how did the media treat them?
Well, again, the conventional wisdom is that the media did not get along with Eisenhower and certainly did not get along with Nixon. In truth, Eisenhower had his doubts about the media. That's one of the reasons why he held so many news conferences live and on television and radio and were reprinted in all of the major newspapers. Some of the press he felt very comfortable with. Some of the press, like the famous muckraker Drew Pearson, he could not stand. And the fact is, with Richard Nixon, he had a multitude of fans in the media, but he also had a multitude of detractors in the media, and it went so far even to the Herb Block cartoons, where you have an unshaven Nixon coming out of a sewer hole, looking like a derelict.
You know, there's historically, baby boomers in particular, have been taught that, the 50s were a quiet time and America was just kind of settling in and starting to become itself of the new future. The fact of the matter was, between 52 and 61, a lot of things happened. You've done a lot of research on this. Share with our listeners, if you would, what are some things that we have forgotten about, that those two were responsible for, that those two were engaged in, and how did the world change, and how did America emerge differently as a result of that administration?
Well, probably the most sad commentary that has been written is the conventional wisdom is Harry Truman was Abraham Lincoln's heir, and Eisenhower was a wasteland for civil rights, and then all of a sudden you get John Kennedy and especially Lyndon Johnson, who are the saviors of the civil rights movement. The fact is that Eisenhower was actively involved in civil rights. The singular loudest and most vocal advocate in the press to advance civil rights, black civil rights, was Richard Nixon. And what Eisenhower did, for example, is when he comes into office, one of the first things he does is desegregate the Capitol. While Truman issues the order to desegregate the armed forces, it's really Dwight Eisenhower that desegregates the armed forces. And we all know that Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, has the unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education desegregating schools. And the other four Supreme Court justices that Eisenhower appoints were all supportive of Brown, and down the food chain in the federal circuit courts and the courts of appeal, Eisenhower tries and almost all of the time gets people that are strong supporters of desegregation.
What about, and again, you've done a lot of research on Richard Nixon. I think the common thing would be that, again, there may have been respect between these two men. They saw each other as complementary to one another. Richard Nixon, not much of a golfer. Ike obviously was. Are they the kind of guys that on their day off would enjoy playing golf with one another?
They did. But again, you have to understand the conventional wisdom was that Richard Nixon regularly saw a psychotherapist. And I found the man was a doctor by the name of Arnold Hutschnecker, and I found his medical files. Well, not only is it untrue, but which is really troublesome for my fellow academics and journalists, Arnold Hutschnecker testified at the Gerald Ford hearings to become Nixon's vice president in November of 1973, and was asked both by House members and Senate members two questions. One, did you ever treat Nixon for psychological problems? The answer was no. The second question was, did you ever treat Richard Nixon for psychiatric problems? The answer was no. Nixon never had a psychiatrist, but if you want to claim that somebody is unstable, you claim that they were, unbalanced. And who could be better suited to be unbalanced than the evil Richard Nixon?
Dwight Eisenhower had wartime experience. He had precious little political experience prior to the presidency. Richard Nixon was, by many people's estimation, the ultimate professional politician, so to speak. How did his apprenticeship as vice president with President Eisenhower, how do you think that may have changed or shaped ultimately a Nixon presidency to follow?
Well, one way it made Nixon the foreign policy president. Eisenhower sent Nixon on a series of very delicate foreign policy missions. And, for example, Eisenhower, as early as the beginning of his presidency, is talking at the National Security Council about we've got to have some kind of relations with what then was called Red China, because we needed boots on the ground to figure out what was going on in Peking. So it wasn't something that was totally unpredictable of a Nixon presidency to fly to Peking and see Mao Zedong. They were talking about it years and years before.
Well, you've done, again, lots and lots of research on both of these two guys, but what, as a result of the research you did specifically for this work called The President and the Apprentice, what did you find that was the most surprising to you?
The most surprising thing to me, sadly to say, is how purposefully wrong authors have gotten it. It wasn't only intuitive, it was purposeful. The nature of the relationship between these two men, both epical figures, have somehow been trivialized and minimized to make it appear to be just the opposite of what occurred. And the only way you can write history is by doing the work. This book, for example, took me 20 years and about 3 million pages of documents. And if that's what it takes to do it, that's what you've got to do. Why so many people were interested in being politically correct, I'm very sorry, but they just didn't do the job.
Have any of the Eisenhower family or Nixon family had a chance to read this, and had they commented to you about it?
Yes, they have, but I think that they probably want to remain private.
All right, fair enough. Well, again, the work is called The President and the Apprentice, Eisenhower-Nixon, 1952 to 61, by Dr. Irwin F. Gellman, and it is published by Yale University Press. And Dr. Gellman, you're going to be in Kansas City in the relatively near future. Tell us about that.
Well, the Dwight D. Eisenhower Library, the Harry S. Truman Library, and the Harry Truman Center for Governmental Affairs at the University of Missouri in Kansas City is having me speak on October 8th.
And how could people find out more information about that? I'd probably just go to the university website, I would think.
I would think that you would go on the Harry S. Truman Center for Governmental Affairs, and they'll see, I believe I'm speaking at the National Archives in Kansas City.
Okay. And also, again, to find out more about other works that you've done and find out more about you, where can people go to find out more?
They can go on my website, irwingellmanbooks.com, or Amazon, or Barnes & Noble, or any fine bookstores, and the book is there.
Well, we appreciate you spending time with us today. We know you're busy, and it's a fascinating work. Again, the title, The President and the Apprentice, Eisenhower and Nixon, 1952 to 61. Thank you again so much.
Thank you for your time.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.